Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name is Ivana Harenque if you're new here, and if you're not, thank you for coming back. Today is Friday, May the 27th, and today we're going to talk about something that we haven't touched on this week just because of all of the other news happening. Now, that is the drama that has surrounded NIL between several well-known college coaches, including Nick Saban, Jimbo Fisher, and others. Today, I am joined by our recruiting reporter, Nick Alvarez, and Nick is here today to talk about something that I think might have been lost in this argument, and that is while the adults are fighting about this, meaning, again, these coaches, who's actually taking care of the kids, the teenagers whose lives are dependent on this and whose bank accounts are the ones who are affected. So Nick is here today to talk a little bit about that and about who is educating the kids about the changing economy in football. So, Nick, thank you for joining me here today. This is a really complicated issue, and I know there's been some changes since NIL first started. And again, that's name, image, and likeness for those of you who are new to this conversation. But we've all learned a little bit about it in the past week or so, just with all of these coaches bickering at each other. So first, kind of tell me a little bit about NIL, just as an introduction for people who aren't familiar with it.
Yeah. So for the last few years, I guess even longer, people have been asking for college athletes to get compensated more than just a scholarship that they're offered when they sign on to the program. And I believe in 2019, California led the way in really pushing a bill through the state legislature to make sure that kids were receiving some compensation through multiple Supreme Court cases, culminating in last June's NCAA versus Alston case. The Supreme Court essentially ruled that the NCAA can't determine that players are amateurs, and instead they will have to be paid for the work that they're providing to the school, whether it be, a number one Alabama jersey that doesn't have the name Tagovailoa on the back, or, some of the branded deals that athletes on the pro level can do, athletes weren't able to do, even though in a college town like Alabama, the starting quarterback of the Crimson Tide is a celebrity and could have some opportunity. So in the last June, the NCAA essentially lost and then took a step back and said, hey, state legislatures, you guys figure it out. And states were essentially decided to make their own rules or what could be allowed in regards to players, recruiting, and NIL and sponsorship deals. Alabama was one of the states that actually put together a law that was more restrictive than what the NCAA would end up allowing. So in the last few months, the Alabama state legislature has joined others in repealing that law, just outright saying that it's because Alabama and Auburn weren't being able to compete on the recruiting side with NIL. We've then seen the rise of collectives, which is a fancy term for boosters coming together and pooling money to give these players sponsorship deals. And now to last week, Nick Saban, Jimbo Fisher, Lane Kiffin, and other coaches essentially complaining that NIL is being used in recruiting, where in theory it's supposed to only be used when a kid's already enrolled and eligible, for Instagram deals, sponsorships, and stuff like that.
That's an interesting point that I think might have gotten lost in this, especially for some of us who maybe aren't as immersed in that college football and high school football world like you are, Nick. And that is that this NIL law was intended to be used for players who are playing for colleges, right? Not in the recruitment ordeal here. But alas, that is where we are, whether it is right or wrong. That's another conversation, right? So we have all of these coaches who are getting in these very public arguments. Again, whether you agree with it or not, they are getting in these public arguments, throwing names and other claims against each other in the press. That has been going on now for a week or so here. But if you back up and you look at the people who are actually the most affected, which are these teenagers, who is helping them with this? Because I know this is something that is very confusing. I mean, you're sitting here having to explain it to us, and it's just blurry for a lot of adults, let alone teenagers who might have never had a job at all, let alone a super well-paying job, right? So
exactly.
I think what's interesting is you lead into the story. We're going to link it here for people to read. You lead into a story talking about Curtis Perry and about kind of a list of reasons why Curtis Perry's value was attributed to about $15,000 in NIL deals. Now, you mentioned several things, including his skills on the field, his personality, and even his Instagram followers, and how that kind of came up with this number. So tell me more about how these collectives or these boosters wind up with a number when they just look at a player. Tell me how that happens.
So the idea, again, this is in theory the way it's supposed to work, is, a player like Curtis Perry. He was a 4-star, a big piece of Alabama's recruiting class late last December, local Pike Road kid. And he loved his recruitment. He was very boisterous about it. He was able to go out there and really enjoy himself. And he became a name because fans, like we all do, attracted to the stuff. We wanted to know, where is he going? What's going to happen to him? And boosters can look at that and say, if I have a company that's related to Tuscaloosa and Curtis Perry is a big name Alabama Crimson Tide talent, we can bring him in, do a little sponsorship deal with him, and associated with the number of Instagram followers he has, like any other influencer would look at. Now, the algorithm I mentioned in the story is a proprietary one created by On3, which is a national recruiting service like 24/7 and Rivals, and they essentially compile what a school's name value looks like, what a college town means to that community, if it's big enough to warrant some of this attention. And yes, a player's Instagram, Twitter, TikTok followers to show what's their audience like if a company were to come to them and say, hey, we want to have you endorse our brand.
This is sounding a lot like how pretty much any influencer on the internet gets deals. Essentially, if you are familiar with Instagram, with TikTok, or any of these other platforms that you might know, an influencer can apply to different places to get sponsorships. And oftentimes they have to give out numbers, including their numbers of followers, the types of maybe brands they've worked with before, things that they like to do, their hobbies, things like that. That's almost what it seems like for these football players. They are here, and other college athletes, they are here to, or presumably being recruited to play their game, to do their craft. But all of these outside factors seem to be kind of factoring into this.
Yeah, and it can even go further than that. There is an interesting line, I guess it's being blurred a little bit, with a fan technically can join a collective with their own hard-earned money. They can sign up online. They can get NFTs from it. They can get an autograph appearance. They can get a cameo, or a type of shout-out video produced by the player. And these companies or collectives can kind of be go-betweens. In Alabama's previous law, the school wasn't allowed to help a kid find a deal or see if the deal was compliant with NCAA rules. Repealing that law allowed Alabama to essentially, and I mentioned this in the story, create kind of a pseudo career services department that is going to allow players to work with someone who's essentially looking out for them, again, in theory. But what's happened is, because college football is crazy, this is going into recruiting and it's saying, hey, we know we can get you this deal if you come here. And that's kind of not how it's supposed to work. The Athletic reported that a recruit has apparently signed, a high schooler currently has signed a multi-million-dollar deal with a collective from the University of Tennessee. And that this should not happen within any of the rules. In Miami, there's a very, very well-known collective by a billionaire and lawyer down there who is going at people on Twitter talking about how what he is doing is all right, and if the NCAA wants to come crack down on it, he's going to be screaming out about antitrust violations. So it's the catch-all term has become the Wild West. The bag men that would be rumored bringing monies to players or dropping off free cars, that's essentially being all legalized.
Well, it almost sounds like this is kind of an auction, right? You
Yeah.
might, as an athlete, choose a school not based on the excellence of their program that you are going for, but rather on the amount of money you can get from going to that school.
Yeah, which is totally within their right if that's what's best for them and their family, because it's a very small portion of players who end up making it to the NFL and making some of that life-changing money that we've been accustomed to them seeing. I think when players are making these decisions, it's also kind of revealing a bit for the coaches for wanting them to come in. And according to Nick Saban, they haven't even engaged in those conversations with players before they get to campus. Jimbo Fisher might say otherwise, but the idea is players should be offering something on the field and then getting some of these benefits. Saban in the past has talked about creating a collective where all of his players earn the same amount of money, because as we all know in football, an offensive lineman isn't as prestigious or as glamorous as the quarterback or star wide receiver.
Well, this you bring up an interesting point that I wanted to ask you, and that is, isn't kind of the root of all of this that NIL is supposed to happen again when you're on the field and not in recruiting? We get that that might be the goal here and kind of the idea of this, but is it against the rules to do this during recruiting?
Yes, it is, and the NCAA, like I said, they kind of took a step back last year when they lost the Supreme Court case. And now they put out guidance a few weeks ago. They're trying to somehow regulate it. I think that's what caused Saban to kind of cry out. That's what's causing some of these coaches to complain about it on a national level, is because they want some regulation. I think part of it is because Saban doesn't want to play the recruiting game with NIL when you can sell the Alabama brand on its own and what the future has with players. I also think a part of it is coaches don't understand kind of the shifting dynamic. I wrote about something last week that California nearly passed a bill, or nearly got a bill to a vote, that would have forced California public and private universities to share revenue from the men's and women's basketball teams and football teams with their players with a commensurate value, which would essentially mark the end of revenue sharing. Nick Saban's had to fear about this, that the other sports that don't generate as much money, that rely on the money that Alabama football brings in, they wouldn't be getting that anymore. It's a very slippery slope. And when coaches are complaining about it, I think it's a little bit of a personal gain, but also what I mentioned in the piece, players have no idea as they're going through this. I led with the Perrys and their story because, a few blocks away in Montgomery, where they're having this banquet, the state legislature was repealing this law, and it was changing in real time. And there was just no guidance. There's nothing in place for a high schooler to look in, hey, what does this mean for me? Especially when, they can be in contact with the school and then get a call from a booster of that school, which is not technically a representative because they're a third party, but they're also kind of hearing the same things, or they're hearing a similar recruiting pitch and then getting a dollar amount attached to that. And it's just really confusing. And even the people who are supposed to be keeping track of it, it's hard because the NCAA doesn't know what's technically not allowed. What are they going to pursue? They've said that they're going to look back at the most egregious cases of NIL and recruiting. What does that mean? It's essentially a blank canvas for antitrust, for collectives producing this. And I think, like you mentioned before, the players are kind of getting stuck in the middle.
Well, and also too, this seems just like a huge gray area. Like there is not a black area, a white area, and you're one or the other. It seems like there is so much middle ground. There's so much gray, and there's a lot of loopholes that some of these written out laws and some of these written out policies provide. And that is always what creates confusion. Now, another thing I wanted to ask you, Nick, when NIL first came out, so many people envisioned this as, say, a Nike cutting a deal with a player. Even if you want to go a little bit more local, get away from the international brands, you look at something like a Regions Bank, right, based in Birmingham. You and I are both in Birmingham, and they sponsor somebody for a local school or an Alabama-based school. That is, I think, what people had in mind. But now you're talking about these boosters, these collectives, and even fans having the possibility to join. And that seems also very different from kind of what the premise of NIL was.
Yeah. And it's because we're in this gray area and still figuring it out. We don't know what's going to be allowed and what's not going to be allowed, even a year from now. Something that's been fascinated by, and I didn't mention it in the story, but, recruits for years will look at, they'll go to a visit to Georgia, for example, and then they'll put on their Instagram photos of them in Georgia, and then they'll share it on Twitter and say, hey, at Dogs Nation or Georgia fans, can we get my follower count up? And it's because what kid doesn't love Instagram followers? In an NIL age, a kid can do that at Alabama, Georgia, Texas, wherever. And technically, the more followers he gets is going to help him when he's looking for an NIL deal, trying to sign a deal with a brand based on the number of followers and the amount of engagement he has. Not that there's anything nefarious there, but this thing that's been a staple in kids just being kids forever now has some financial ramifications. Depending on if Alabama gets me 3,000 followers and it's over 10,000 now, that's more money in my pocket potentially.
It makes me even feel old to say this, Nick, but I'm so glad I didn't have Instagram when I was in high school, when I was a teenager, because you're a teenager. Again, you're in high school, and the thought of $200 seems pretty promising there, let alone you get into these thousands of dollar numbers, and that must be overwhelming. So at the end of the day, who is helping the kids? Are they supposed to go to their parents and talk about this, who also might not understand? I mean, we are both adults, and I know I have a hard time understanding all of this. So who are they supposed to go to? Is there somebody who is maybe stationed with their school district or maybe with the Alabama Athletics Association? Who do they turn to?
For now, there kind of isn't, which I think is a problem. The Alabama Football Coaches Association partnered with Ecker Sports, which is then a service that started a business that literally began a few months before the Alston decision. And they're business is essentially selling guides to parents and coaches and players about what NIL is. And they haven't even created the parent and player playbook yet. They recently started offering video courses to high school coaches. There's an anecdote I have in the story of a high school coach in Texas going to Tim Prukop, the head of Eckerd Sports, and saying, hey, I don't know, I want to keep my head in the sand about this. I have 1,000 things to worry about. I have a 9-to-5 job on coaching high school football. What am I supposed to know about this? And Tim mentioned, hey, who do you think they're going to go to? They're going to go to 7-on-7 coaches. They're going to go to unreliable sources on the internet. They're going to listen to these boosters who, they'll ask for forgiveness later. And who cares if a player becomes ineligible because of it? There's no direct path. So I think high school coaches have stepped in a little bit. I think with some type of more strict legislation or type of more general understanding of, okay, this is allowed, this isn't, parents will maybe start to get a better understanding, but because state by state, it's different. School by school, it can be different. And then there could be multiple collectives for one school. There's just so many avenues where a kid can get potentially wrong information that there are the ones that they could get right information, it's lagging right now.
Sounds incredibly complicated. Nick, what is next? Do we expect the NCAA to come out with any of these kind of more clarification policies soon, or do we expect that to be a little bit further down the line? When is this going to resolve itself?
I think what we're waiting for the other hat to drop now is what is the NCAA going to determine the egregious violations are? What are they going to put their foot down and say, hey, we can't do this? In Miami, there was a case where a player that was currently on the team asked for more money because a new player came in with a higher NIL deal and then threatened to transfer. Is that allowed? What is it going to look like in terms of the 1-year transfer rule? In Texas, the top quarterback in the country last year, Quinn Ewers, left high school early to go to Ohio State and then transferred back into Texas so he can get NIL eligibility. The Louisiana High School State Athletic Association, people assume because of Arch Manning, has allowed potentially high schoolers to start getting some of these NIL deals. The Alabama High School Athletic Association has vehemently said they will not do that. They don't want to do that. What happens if a kid starts saying, hey, I'll go transfer to IMG in Florida. I'll go transfer to Texas. I'll go transfer to a state where I can start earning money now.
Oh gosh, it seems like this is going to be a long conversation that we're going to be having for a while to come. Nick, I guess we've got to become financial advisors now on top of everything else. Thank you so much for your expertise on this. I know that we will have to have you back as the season progresses and as some of these rules progress to kind of break it down there. So Nick, again, thank you for your time here. We're going to link your story so people could read about that and kind of get a little bit behind the curtain as to what some of these NIL deals and some of this controversy is. So again, Nick, thank you so much. Everybody watching, thank you. Have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you next week.